When I left the National Science Foundation a little over a year ago, I was job hunting, and everybody asks, are you in the academic side, the industry side, the government side, some other side? And the answer is yes. And being in that gray area is kind of bad when you're job hunting. But in terms of work, it's very interesting. I think that's where the really interesting stuff happens. So I'm going to have you take a look at these two columns. So if you read through these are talk titles from two conferences which were held within about a month of each other. One was academic, one was underground. And I'm going to have you read through and kind of see if you can tell which is which. So I will reveal that the left was USENIX Security, big academic conference, and the right was DEF CON. And I'm wondering how many people guessed correctly. You know, as I saw more of this some people did, it's awesome. As I saw more of this during my time at NSF, it struck me as ironic that over the past 10 years, it's getting harder sometimes to figure out the difference as the research seems to converge. So this is my premise of the talk today, that academic and what I'll call non-academic security and privacy research has become indistinguishable from one another. So given this premise, I'll ask you to think about two things during the talk. One, how can we bring the two approaches together to have a greater impact on security? And two, is the distinction between these two becoming meaningless, or is research just research no matter who does it? So this is not a new concept, and if you've been around security for a while, this is not very new. So I'll try to reframe some of these things, and this is why we'll go through this. A couple of thought-provoking examples, some obstacles that still exist, some solutions that have been pretty successful, and a call for help. So I thought this term gray literature, I just learned about it not long ago. It's just a term coined by a librarian, Charles Auger, when he was cataloging World War II intel reports and notes on atomic research. And I feel like we see a lot of this gray literature in security. You know, we know underground work's being done anonymously or not, you know, on online forums, in person with groups of people at makerspaces and conferences and hackathons and bug bounties. And it's outside the normal academic and commercial publishing channels. So let's see an example of where the two communities could have done better, the academic and non-academic communities. So many of you maybe, this example has gone around for a while. This was one, if you're not familiar with it, of a researcher, Jay Ratcliffe. He's a type 1 diabetic and a security researcher. And he had worn a Johnson & Johnson insulin pump since he was 22. Being a good researcher, he saw that if he could hack into it, because of course this could be life-threatening. So he used a serial number to wirelessly disable, raise, and lower his own insulin. He brought this to Johnson & Johnson. They ended up working in partnership to do a huge recall of I don't know how many thousands of these insulin pumps. They suggested he publish it in a journal, a medical journal, to kind of show medical researchers that, you know, the medical field's terrible when it comes to securing patient devices, so could this example influence it? He could not get published in any journal. Doesn't have a PhD, doesn't have an MD. There wasn't enough rigor in his methods. Breaking into an insulin pump apparently is not rigorous enough. So in 2017, he had a talk at DEF CON where he talked about using the scientific method in security research. And what he urged non-academics to do is employ some more rigor. So, you know, use a methodology. It doesn't have to be perfect, but have a hypothesis, get some legal advice because he ran into some legal issues with Johnson & Johnson, collect the data, and learn about disclosure. I'm going to go over a historical example next, and the example I'm going to show is going to kind of bring about some research, show you some research that could have been lost forever to history. So if you took a high school biology class, you're familiar with Mendel, who's the father of genetics, and Mendel's law of inheritance, which talks about how traits are passed down to children. So Mendel worked as a gardener and a beekeeper. He was a monk, and he did experiments on pea plants in the monastery garden to develop new color variants. This is just a hobby. He tried to publish his paper about what he observed for many, many years, and his paper was rejected by all the big name societies, the Royal Society, the Linnaean Society, the Smithsonian. He was rejected because he was a novice, was not a trained scientist, was a monk. What did he know? So he published it in his local journal in the town of Brno. It was found by pure chance, this obscure journal, in 1902, as this Dutch botanist was, his friend was cleaning out some old journals and found this paper and said, well, this looks kind of interesting. And just by happenstance, it kind of then made the rounds in scientific circles, and by pure chance, By 1909, several of these things we know to be related about genetics were pinned to Mendel's discoveries. So something that could have been lost forever because his work was really what I'll call underground. So if we want to encourage non-standard thinking by non-academics, yet leverage the academic rigor to enable change and security, how do we do that? So let's look at a recent, what I think is a pretty successful example. So back in 2017 and 18, there was a voting village at DEF CON where they assembled a slew of voting machines from states, got them in a big room, and had people kind of see what they can do to break into them and break them and find vulnerabilities. The success of this was that it got together academics, government, hackers, and kids. So last year there was, with the kids village there were like an 11-year-old, 12-year-old kids who were doing this. The thought being if they could break into it, that's pretty insecure for voting. 2018, so that was in 2017, and then 2018, voting machine manufacturers actually sent threatening letters to eBay resellers that selling the machines is illegal, which isn't true. I think that in itself is a sign of success. So one of the things that came out of this was a very professional report, some congressional hearings, and a lot of really good PR, which is so important in the security community because we are terrible storytellers. We, amongst ourselves, we're like, this is on fire, this is horrible, but we're terrible at communicating our story to average people who really need to understand it. So a lot of the PR and a lot of the stories you've read in the past few years about voting and securities, these are fairly carefully crafted by folks who really wanted to get the right message out. Of course, on the academic side, many have said, we've known this for years, this isn't new, which is kind of the point, is how do you resuscitate something that maybe has been around for a while, but bring it into the spotlight where one can enact some change. So this valley of death and security, again, it's not new. Many companies, though, are eliminating their research arms that cost a lot of money. And I'd say that a lot of federally funded security and privacy research is fairly incremental. They have to be safe. A lot of the published research is designed to prevent huge shifts. It's got to be done safely. And a lot of the academic work is simply not often translatable to the real world, which is fine for truly scientific discoveries, but I'd argue that much of security in our world is applied. So this might be a different approach. So these are some reactions to the idea. I started crowdsourcing this when I was still in government. I had some access to different types of people. So I'll let you kind of read through here. Many academics said it would just ruin my credibility, especially ones who are junior. It makes sense. Industry, they don't care. They want things to sell. Underground folks, ironically, the person who spoke for the underground faction was one of the big social media companies who did this kind of underground stuff in his non-day job. But he suggested, what is research anyway? As long as we get experimentation, who cares who does it? And most interestingly, government funders found it was a really good way, potentially, to get good research. That was the most shocking to me. So there's still a lot of obstacles to make this happen. Again, this is not a new concept. The first, of course, being the ethical and legal ones. Institutional review boards, if you're an academic, it's widely varies between institutions. Many of them are set up to deal with animal research, not human research. Offensive research, just in academia, that's just not going to happen if you're federally funded. The incentives are different. The incentive is to get tenure. You want a paper at a top conference and journals, and you need funding for yourself and your grad student. And finding trusted collaborators. It's hard to engage with academia. This workshop is great because everybody's welcome. Many academic workshops are invitation only. They're closed. It's hard to get into. And failure in that world is considered bad. So obstacles to non-academia, culture. Many people, they just do it for what they're doing for personal satisfaction. They have day jobs. It's a challenge to them. They don't need or want an official collaboration. If you go to one of these conventions or cons, it's a different culture. There's people drinking at 10 in the morning and people, doing things you wouldn't see at an academic conference. So it can be kind of hard to navigate that. And again, the legal responsible disclosure standards are often not clear. So there have been some successes so far in this model. DARPA, when Peter Zatko Mudge was there as the program director between that short time period, He found that cyber incidents kept increasing from 2006 to 2011, but at the same time, federal defense spending on cyber also increased. So he started this fast track program, and I forget what the amount was, but it was a pretty low dollar amount. But the time frame, if you had a really good idea and you were an academic, it was 7 days from submitting a proposal to getting your money. And if you've dealt with NSF or other government funding cycles, that's like, wow. So that was very successful. One of the successes was the Charlie Miller and Chris Vlasic car hacking research that came out of one of the fast track grants. That was 2015. There have been at many academic conferences an experience track to get kind of feedback from operators or engineers who are in the field to learn from them. There's less of this, but that was very successful. Of course, there's bug bounties. I am the cavalry. I think that's a really interesting mix of kind of security and safety and trying to influence government for this to get high quality information to be used by decision makers. And this DoD hacked the Pentagon. I wasn't familiar with it, but I guess it was a bug hunt. But there was no understanding about what activities in the bug hunt were acceptable. So it was not repeated after the one time. So what can be done on the academic side? I think sponsoring non-academics, and I actually heard this from a few researchers, sponsoring non-academics, people who are, there's a lot of smart industry people, get them to participate in the grants. Participation by undergraduates. I mean, I'm at a university, and undergraduates are some of like the most energetic, think outside the box people. Get them to participate on the grants. Many of the foundations and funding agencies are amenable to including some sort of underground component with oversight by the PIs. So if we think about how to harness it, how to control it, so it's done in a rational manner, that's a good way to get some research in. Inviting non-academics to workshops. I was at one workshop on algorithmic bias, and it explicitly was half academic and half non-academic, and the discussions were so rich and so varied. Getting these diverse points of view to influence research and security is just so very important. And on the academic side, this is like a Sisyphean task, but publishing conference papers and for free, open on the internet, it would be immensely helpful. So how about on the other side? Some matchmaking would be really great. So these non-academic cons that are hosted, there's many of these that are hosted around the country. Academics need results and techniques of offensive research. They need to have access to that research. The issue, though, is getting them to attend these cons. But if they could, people I spoke to are amenable to having some kind of matchmaking to learn from one another. I cannot tell you how many academics, no offense to any of the academics here, but many of them do not know the practical security challenges oftentimes are very elusive to them in terms of usability and using security tools that operators and security engineers have to use. So I think a mutual education of how to use those, and then from the academic side, what are your challenges as an operator, can be very beneficial. I think some media training, understanding the insulin pump example shows we as security researchers are bad at telling our story. If we want to influence change, we need to do it better. More writing about what didn't work. In science, you see this all the time. Failure's bad, you don't want to talk about what's bad. But on the other side, if you have a day job and you're doing this for fun, you can talk about what didn't work in your experiment with a little bit more rigor in your methods. So how about on the government side? This is like the third part of this stool. These panels where funding decisions are made and we talk about what kind of the strategic goals are for security. The ones who are on the front lines are CISOs, security engineers, privacy officers. They absolutely should have input into this. Some sort of community advisory boards. They know what the challenges are day to day, and we can shorten this cycle by really harnessing their knowledge. Crowdsourcing some research among non-academics. Is this a good idea? What are the grand challenges? Could also pay dividends. And more clarity, I would ask the legal community, more clarity in helping us, how to define ethical research and restrictions on offensive research needs. That's where the legal folks can help very much. So specifically, this all sounds great. So specifically, what can be done? There's a lot of conferences. This one is a great start. There's IEEE has this SecDev, Secure Development Conference, started a couple years ago, same kind of notion for software people. I think this is a really good start to bring people together. So more of these neutral conferences. I think a day on the front or the back end of an academic or HackerCon to bring people together in a neutral forum could be very interesting. I think being able to present research and data collection challenges for almost everybody. Data, just getting access to data to do experimentation is a challenge. So is there some way that data sets can be shared? Physical meetings, people, a lot of people don't like them, but if there's a place to physically meet, that's very helpful. I think some of these capture the flags with academics and hackers as equals. I think there's a lot to learn from each other in setting up and participating in methodology and how operators go about doing their business and some of the research they're not considering. And finally, as I said, engage in the legal community. So maybe a journal. Journals take time. Journals take people's time to write. They take time to peer review. The one existing one in our world, this POC GTFO, this is great, but it's very hands-on. It's kind of, it's not something you're going to bring into work necessarily. It's really a manual more than a journal. There's a new journal that started this year, this ACM Digital Threats Research and Practice, which is a little more kind of applied security. But maybe a new one, maybe something online where people can put their research. It's not as rigorous as an academic paper, but it's a place. If you're a non-academic researcher, you have a day job, you still want to have some place to put your stuff where people can read it. So are there any other models for this? So one of the really great models I've seen for about the past 10 years is in the biohacking, or you call it quantified self, or it started out as DIY bio. So this community is really interesting. Started out in the early 2000s. Well, the FBI started contacting the DIY bio groups. They were mostly concerned about synthetic biology. So they started coming to the meetups. They started going to these spaces saying, what are you really doing here? And at these spaces, if you've never been to a DIY bio meetup or space, and I've been to some of these, is a really interesting mix of real research scientists from universities, people who just took high school biology, but who really have a love of it and want to learn, all kind of working together on a challenge. They kind of harness together some tools and work on a challenge. Well, the FBI started observing this, and you can see the founder of DIYbio.org, you can see his quote, that discussions between the community and the FBI have educated both sides. And it became obvious that we are not the enemy. And you can see in DC, the FBI folks that deal with this community, they're very amenable and understand the culture, and they want to bridge the two sides. So a call to help. So for upcoming DEF CON, for the AI Village, the same folks who did the Voting Village are looking to do something in AI, and I am one of them, seeking a meaningful research challenge, something in AI, potentially around information manipulation, which we just talked about, something that would motivate accountability and legislation around online platforms, something that would draw in, as it did before, academics, people with spare time, students who want to do this, to converge and have a really interesting outcome. Challenges being, some of these insidious deep fake videos. Can they be detected, created, identified in near real time? Fake news identification. Everybody's concerned about fake news, but how do you communicate that to your average citizen? We're still kind of wrestling with what would make good research, but also get people to understand how threatening this really is. So I welcome any, during the Q&A or afterwards, any comments, thoughts, ideas, whether this is good or bad or crazy or it's all been done before, please let me know and make something happen.